What would you do if someone judged you solely by your appearance? For Officer Parker, it was just another day of enforcing the law until he arrested the wrong man. But what he didn't know was that his so-called suspect wasn't just any man. He was an FBI agent, and in just a few minutes, Parker's entire world would come crashing down. Officer Parker was the kind of cop who walked with confidence but carried a dangerous chip on his shoulder. In his mid-40s, he had spent nearly 2 decades patrolling the streets of the city. His graying hair and stern jawline added an air of authority, but his demeanor was far from approachable. Known for his sharp tongue and unwavering sense of superiority, Parker saw himself as someone who could spot trouble a mile away. What others called biases, he called instinct. To Parker, the world was divided into 2 types: those who obeyed and those who didn't. Derrick Bennett was a picture of quiet confidence. In his early 30s, his tailored suit and polished shoes made him stand out as he walked through the bustling downtown streets. A former Marine and now an FBI agent, Derrick carried himself with the discipline and composure honed through years of service. His dark eyes reflected a calm intensity, and his posture commanded respect without arrogance. Derrick often avoided unnecessary confrontation, preferring to let his actions speak louder than words. Yet beneath his calm exterior lay a resolve stronger than steel, a trait that would soon be tested in unexpected ways. The city hummed with its usual rhythm that day: honking cars, chattering pedestrians, and the occasional siren cutting through the noise. Derrick was on his way to meet a colleague when Parker spotted him from his patrol car. Derrick's black SUV, clean and polished, caught Parker's attention. But it wasn't the vehicle that made him suspicious. It was the man driving it. To Parker, Derrick's composed demeanor seemed like defiance. As Derrick parked near a coffee shop, Parker decided to investigate. What should have been a routine interaction was about to spiral into something much bigger than either man could imagine. Officer Parker stepped out of his patrol car, his boots crunching against the gravel as he approached Derrick's black SUV. He adjusted his belt and squared his shoulders, the usual routine he employed to assert dominance. Derrick, meanwhile, had just stepped out of his vehicle, briefcase in hand, glancing at his watch as if calculating how much time he had before his next meeting. "Excuse me," Parker called out, his voice sharp. "Is this your car?" Derrick looked up, his calm demeanor unfazed by Parker's tone. "Yes, officer. Is something wrong?" Parker scanned Derrick from head to toe, his gaze lingering as if searching for trouble. "Mind telling me what you're doing around here?" Derrick raised an eyebrow. "I parked. I'm meeting someone for coffee." The simplicity of Derrick's reply seemed to irk Parker. "This area is not exactly where I'd expect someone like you," Parker said, his voice laced with insinuation. Derrick met Parker's gaze, his voice steady. "And what exactly does that mean, officer?" A few pedestrians slowed, sensing the tension, but Parker ignored them, determined to assert control. His mind was already racing with assumptions, setting the stage for what would happen next. Parker's hand hovered near his belt as he stared Derrick down. "Step away from the car," he barked, his voice louder now. Derrick exhaled quietly but complied, placing his hands at his sides and moving toward the sidewalk. "Is there a reason for this, officer?" "I'll ask the questions," Parker snapped, circling the SUV as if it held some secret contraband. He peered inside the tinted windows, finding nothing out of the ordinary. Derrick stood calmly, his posture unthreatening. "If you tell me what you're looking for, maybe I can help." Parker ignored him, now rummaging through his mental playbook for reasons to justify his behavior. The frustration in his voice was growing. "License and registration," he demanded. Derrick hesitated for a moment before reaching for his wallet. His calmness seemed to infuriate Parker even more. The officer interpreted Derrick's composed demeanor as arrogance, a challenge to his authority. Hands where I can see them, Parker shouted abruptly, causing passers-by to glance nervously. Derrick raised his hands, his jaw tightening slightly. Officer, I'm doing exactly as you asked, Derrick said, his voice firm but still composed. There's no need for this. But Parker wasn't listening. In his mind, Derrick's calmness was proof he was hiding something. By now, a small crowd had gathered, their murmurs adding to the tension. Parker pulled out his cuffs, stepping closer to Derrick. Turn around. You're under arrest. For what? Derrick asked, his tone sharper but still controlled. You haven't told me what I've done. Parker smirked, his sense of control growing with each passing second. Resisting an investigation and acting suspicious, he replied, though his words lacked conviction. Derrick's jaw tightened. He could feel the weight of the cuffs as Parker clasped them onto his wrists. Despite the humiliation, Derrick didn't resist. He turned his head slightly and spoke quietly, his words measured. Officer, you're making a mistake bigger than you can imagine. The calm warning sent a ripple through Parker, but he quickly dismissed it as bravado. We'll see about that, he muttered, leading Derrick to the patrol car. The murmurs among the crowd grew louder. A few pulled out their phones, recording the interaction. Parker ignored them, slamming the car door shut behind Derrick. Inside the car, Derrick sat silently, his gaze steady as he looked out the window. Parker felt a twinge of unease but shook it off, determined to believe he had the upper hand. At the station, Officer Parker led Derrick through the halls, his grip firm on the cuffs as though it was a badge of pride. Colleagues glanced up from their desks, curious about the man Parker had brought in. Derrick, calm and composed, walked without resistance. His suit, though slightly rumpled from the rough handling, still spoke of authority. Got myself another one, Parker declared smugly, pushing Derrick toward the holding area. He glanced at Ramirez, who was seated nearby. Suspicious guy loitering in the wrong neighborhood, pretty open and shut. Ramirez looked up, his brow furrowing slightly. Something about Derrick's presence didn't sit right. The man didn't exude guilt or fear, traits Ramirez often saw in detainees. Instead, Derrick carried himself like he was in control, even with cuffs on his wrists. You sure about this, Parker? Ramirez asked hesitantly. Positive, Parker snapped, glaring at him. You think I don't know how to spot trouble? Derrick said nothing, merely sitting down as instructed. His silence seemed to unnerve some of the younger officers. Meanwhile, Parker's arrogance swelled, dismissing any doubts from his peers. This guy thinks he's untouchable, Parker muttered, smirking. Let's see how long that lasts. Back at his desk, Ramirez couldn't shake the image of Derrick's calm, piercing gaze. There was something unsettling about the man. Not in a threatening way, but in a way that hinted at power beyond the confines of the station. Other officers began whispering. Who is this guy? One asked, glancing toward the holding area. He doesn't look like your typical suspect. He's too calm, another said. Usually they're yelling or trying to bargain. This one just sits. Ramirez leaned back in his chair, exchanging a knowing look with Blake, a senior officer who had seen his fair share of questionable arrests. You think Parker's in over his head? Ramirez asked cautiously. Blake nodded slowly. Wouldn't be the first time. Parker's got a habit of letting his ego drive his decisions. Yeah, but this guy... Ramirez's voice trailed off as he stared toward the holding cell. Derrick sat still, his hands resting on the table in front of him, as if he were waiting for a meeting to start. The unease among the officers grew, but no one dared to confront Parker. His bravado was too loud, too confident, and for now it drowned out their doubts. The atmosphere in the station shifted abruptly when 3 black SUVs screeched to a halt outside. The doors swung open, and a group of sharply dressed federal agents stepped out. Their movements were precise, their expressions unreadable. Inside, the front desk officer stumbled over her words. Can I help you? The lead agent, a tall woman with a badge clipped to her belt, stepped forward. "We're here for Derrick Hayes. Take us to him now." Parker, standing nearby, frowned. "Federal agents? What the hell is this about?" The agent turned toward Parker, her eyes cold. "Step aside, Officer Parker. This is above your pay grade." The room fell silent as the agents marched toward the holding area. Ramirez and Blake exchanged wide-eyed glances, their earlier unease now fully justified. Derrick's calm demeanor didn't waver when the agents entered his cell. He stood up, smoothing his suit jacket. "Took you long enough," he said, his tone light but edged with authority. The lead agent nodded. "Let's go." As they escorted Derrick out, Parker's face turned red with confusion and rage. "What's going on here?" he demanded. "Who is this guy?" Parker stormed toward the lead agent as she led Derrick toward the exit. "You can't just walk in here and take my suspect," he shouted, his voice echoing through the station. The agent stopped, slowly turning to face him. "Your suspect?" she repeated, her tone icy. "Officer, Derrick Hayes is a senior FBI agent, and you just made a colossal mistake." Parker froze, his bravado faltering. "An FBI agent? That's impossible." The agent took a step closer, her voice low but cutting. "Did you even check his credentials? Or did you let your biases do the thinking for you?" Ramirez winced at the sharp rebuke, but deep down he felt a sliver of satisfaction. Derrick finally spoke, his voice calm but commanding. "Officer Parker, I warned you. This was bigger than you imagined. Perhaps now you'll start listening." The room fell silent, the weight of Derrick's words sinking in. Parker's confidence crumbled further as he realized the gravity of his actions. As the agents escorted Derrick out, Parker stood frozen, his arrogance replaced with the dawning realization that his career and reputation were in jeopardy. The station buzzed with murmurs, the tide of opinion quickly turning against Parker. The moment Derrick Hayes stepped into the federal SUV, the atmosphere shifted. Inside, the lead agent handed him a file. "We're clearing this up immediately, sir. The press is already circling like vultures." Derrick opened the folder and scanned its contents. "Parker's record needs to be fully exposed," he said, his tone calm but resolute. "This isn't just about me. It's about systemic failure." Back at the station, the tension was suffocating. Officers whispered among themselves, their earlier doubts about Parker now fully realized. Ramirez sat at his desk, replaying the events in his mind. Every cryptic word Derrick had spoken now made sense. The federal agent's visit hadn't just been a rescue, it was a reckoning. Shortly after Derrick left, the chief summoned Parker to his office. With a grim expression, the chief handed Parker a document. "You've just arrested Derrick Hayes, one of the FBI's most decorated agents and a presidential advisor." Parker's face turned pale. "That can't be right. He was acting suspicious." The chief leaned forward, his tone cold. "Suspicious? Or did you see what you wanted to see?" In the coming hours, news broke about Derrick's identity. Major media outlets ran the headline, "FBI agent illegally arrested by local police." The story went viral, and the station's phones lit up with inquiries. Parker's name became synonymous with abuse of power and racial bias. As the public clamored for accountability, journalists began digging into Parker's history. What they uncovered painted a troubling picture. Local records revealed multiple complaints filed against Parker for racial profiling and excessive force, most of which had been quietly dismissed. One case involved an unarmed black man detained for matching a description, while another detailed Parker using unnecessary force during a routine traffic stop. The revelations sparked outrage on social media. Hashtags like "Hold Him Accountable" and "Justice for Derrick" trended within hours. Advocacy groups seized the opportunity, calling for an independent investigation into Parker's record and the station's handling of similar complaints. The chief, now fully aware of the storm brewing, called an emergency meeting. "We can't ignore this any longer," he said, addressing his officers. "Parker's actions have jeopardized not just his career, but the integrity of this entire department." Ramirez sat in the back, torn between relief that justice was being pursued and guilt for not speaking up sooner. He glanced at Parker, who sat with his arms crossed, visibly seething. Parker's bravado finally cracked when a federal investigator arrived at the station, carrying a thick file. "Your history, Officer Parker, is now a federal matter," she said bluntly. "Prepare yourself for consequences." The confrontation between Derrick and Parker came sooner than expected. As part of the federal inquiry, Derrick returned to the station, this time without cuffs. Dressed impeccably in a tailored suit, he radiated authority. Parker, now on desk duty, froze as Derrick walked past him, flanked by agents. Derrick paused, turning to face him. "Officer Parker," he began, his voice calm but firm. "You made assumptions about me, about who I was, based on nothing but bias. Do you understand the consequences of your actions now?" Parker struggled to meet Derrick's gaze. I thought you were suspicious," Derrick cut in. "Or just out of place in a neighborhood you don't think I belong in?" The silence that followed was deafening. Officers nearby stopped what they were doing, their attention drawn to the exchange. "I warned you," Derrick continued. "This was bigger than you could imagine, but you didn't listen. You didn't want to." He stepped closer, his tone sharper. "You're supposed to protect and serve, not judge and harm." Parker opened his mouth, but no words came out. For the first time, he looked genuinely remorseful. The fallout was swift and unrelenting. The department announced Parker's immediate suspension, pending a full investigation. The news spread quickly, with journalists and protesters celebrating the decision as a step toward justice. Within the station, Parker became a pariah. His colleagues avoided him, their earlier support eroded by the evidence piling up against him. Ramirez, though hesitant at first, finally spoke up during an internal meeting. "We've ignored this behavior for too long," he said, his voice steady. "It's time we held ourselves accountable." Outside the station, the public's demand for change grew louder. Protests swelled, with signs calling for police reform and justice for Derrick. Advocacy groups pushed for systemic changes, using Parker's actions as a rallying cry. As for Derrick, his focus wasn't just on Parker, but on the larger issues at play. "This isn't about one officer," he told a reporter during a press briefing. "It's about a culture that allows these abuses to go unchecked. Accountability is just the first step. Reform must follow." The truth was out, and the weight of its implications bore down on everyone involved. For Parker, it marked the end of his career. For Derrick, it was the beginning of a fight for lasting change. The streets outside the police station were no longer quiet. A diverse crowd gathered, their chants echoing through the city. "Justice for Derrick! End racial profiling!" Signs bearing messages like "Protect, don't persecute," and "Accountability now" bobbed above the crowd. Community leaders, clergy members, and activists took to makeshift stages, addressing the growing audience. "This isn't an isolated incident," one speaker declared passionately. "This is a pattern, one we must dismantle." Derrick Hayes stood up for himself, but how many others remain voiceless? News vans lined the streets, broadcasting the scene to the nation. Social media live streams captured the emotional speeches, tearful testimonies, and fiery calls for justice. The protests swelled as people from neighboring cities arrived to join the movement. Inside the station, the officers could hear the chants. Some glanced nervously at the growing crowd, while others pretended to focus on paperwork. Ramirez, seated at his desk, couldn't shake the guilt weighing on him. He knew this moment wasn't just about Parker's actions, but about years of silent complicity. Derrick, watching from a distance, felt a mix of pride and sadness. The protests were powerful, but he knew the fight for systemic change wouldn't end here. This was only the beginning. The viral video that had sparked the initial outrage was now only one part of a larger narrative. News outlets dissected every detail of the incident, from Derrick's calm demeanor during his arrest to Parker's history of complaints. Panel discussions debated the deeper issues of policing, racial bias, and accountability. On Twitter, the hashtags #Justice for Derrick and #End Bias Now dominated the trending list. Activists shared their own stories of racial profiling, while others called for immediate reforms in law enforcement. Influential figures, including celebrities, politicians, and thought leaders, amplified the message. Derrick Hayes is a hero, not just for standing tall, but for exposing the cracks in the system, one prominent activist tweeted. In contrast, Parker's name became a symbol of everything wrong with modern policing. Memes mocked his arrogance, while threads analyzing his body language in the video circulated widely. Users compared him to other officers who had faced public scrutiny for misconduct, further cementing his downfall. Amid the chaos, Derrick remained quiet, choosing to let his actions and the movement speak for themselves. He declined interview requests, knowing that the focus should remain on the larger issues. Yet he couldn't ignore the flood of support, which reminded him of the responsibility he now carried. Parker's once confident demeanor had crumbled under the weight of public and professional scrutiny. Confined to his small apartment during his suspension, he avoided the news, but the world outside was impossible to ignore. Protesters marched past his building daily, their chants piercing through his walls. He sat at his kitchen table, staring at the stack of unopened letters from the department and legal advisors. His phone buzzed incessantly with messages of condemnation, both from strangers and former colleagues. Even his closest friends had distanced themselves, unwilling to be associated with him. Late at night, Parker scrolled through social media, his name trending alongside words like disgrace and racist cop. He watched the video of Derrick's arrest again, this time with a different perspective. Every action, every word he'd spoken, now felt like a weight on his chest. For the first time, Parker felt something foreign: shame. He thought back to Derrick's piercing words at the station. "You're supposed to protect and serve, not judge and harm." The truth of those words stung more than the public's anger. Alone in his apartment, Parker began writing a letter. It wasn't just to apologize to Derrick, but to acknowledge the biases he'd let guide him. For the first time, he confronted the person he had become, hoping it wasn't too late to change. While Parker grappled with his guilt, Derrick embraced the role he had unintentionally stepped into. Invitations flooded in, from universities, police academies, and civil rights organizations, each asking him to share his story and advocate for change. During a televised town hall, Derrick addressed a crowd of thousands. "This isn't about one bad cop," he said firmly. "This is about a system that fails to hold itself accountable. If we want real change, it starts with transparency, training, and trust." He spoke candidly about his arrest, emphasizing that his position as an FBI agent had shielded him from harsher consequences. "If I hadn't been who I am, my story could have ended very differently. That's why this fight isn't just mine. It's for everyone who's been silenced or ignored." Derrick's message resonated deeply. His composed yet impassioned advocacy became a rallying cry for reform. Lawmakers cited his story in debates about police accountability legislation, while activists used his words as a blueprint for action. In private moments, Derrick reflected on how his life had changed. He hadn't sought the spotlight, but now that it was on him, he was determined to use it wisely. His calm demeanor wasn't just his strength, it was a symbol of the resilience and determination needed to achieve lasting change. Parker sat in his dimly lit apartment, pen in hand and a blank sheet of paper before him. For hours, he had struggled to find the words. How could he express remorse for something so deeply wrong? Each time he began, the sentences felt hollow, unworthy of the pain he had caused. He thought of Derrick's unwavering calm during the arrest, the pointed words that had exposed the truth Parker had refused to see. The world's reaction had been clear, but it was Derrick's quiet dignity that stayed with him. Finally, he began to write. "Dear Mr. Hayes, I don't expect forgiveness, but I owe you an apology. I let my biases cloud my judgment and my duty as an officer. You deserved respect and fairness, and I failed to give you either. I've spent the past weeks reflecting on my actions, and I see now how much harm I caused. Not just to you, but to the trust people place in those who wear the badge. I am truly sorry." As the words flowed, Parker felt a weight lift, though the burden of his actions remained. He folded the letter carefully, resolving to deliver it personally once he was allowed to. It wasn't just an apology, it was a commitment to change. The incident ignited a push for sweeping reforms in the department. The chief, under immense public and federal pressure, announced a series of measures aimed at rebuilding trust. Mandatory de-escalation and anti-bias training were implemented, requiring every officer to complete comprehensive courses designed to challenge stereotypes and improve interactions with the community. An independent oversight committee was established to review complaints against officers, ensuring transparency and accountability. The department also introduced body cameras as a standard, with clear policies on their use. The footage from Derrick's arrest became a case study in training sessions, a stark reminder of what happens when authority is misused. Community leaders, including Derrick, were invited to participate in discussions about the reforms. Derrick's presence was a powerful symbol of collaboration, and his calm yet firm approach helped bridge gaps between the police and the public. "Accountability isn't about punishment," Derrick said during one meeting. "It's about ensuring the mistakes of the past don't become the patterns of the future." Though change was slow, the reforms marked a turning point. For many in the community, it was a step toward healing, a recognition that their voices had been heard. Derrick's life had shifted irreversibly. No longer just an FBI agent, he had become a symbol of resilience and justice. His schedule was packed with speaking engagements from universities to town halls, where he shared his story and emphasized the importance of systemic change. In one memorable address to a graduating class of police cadets, Derrick spoke directly to the future of law enforcement. "You have a choice every day," he told them. "You can perpetuate the cycle or you can break it. True strength lies in empathy and understanding, not in power or fear." Derrick also collaborated with civil rights organizations to launch programs aimed at improving police-community relations. One initiative paired officers with community members for open dialogues, breaking down barriers and fostering understanding. Meanwhile, Derrick's personal life remained humble. Despite the accolades, he insisted on keeping his work focused on others. When a journalist asked him how he felt about being called a hero, he smiled faintly and replied, "Heroes aren't perfect. I'm just a man doing what's right." Through his efforts, Derrick became a lasting advocate for accountability, using his platform to inspire others to challenge injustice. His legacy was no longer just about his work in the FBI. It was about the change he had sparked and the hope he had given others. Months after the incident, Derrick found himself walking through the same neighborhood where his arrest had occurred. The streets were quieter now, but they held a different energy, a cautious hope. He stopped at a community mural that had been painted in his honor. The words beneath it read, "Justice with integrity." Derrick touched the edge of the mural, humbled by the impact his experience had created. Elsewhere, Parker stood in the precinct's training room, watching a video on de-escalation tactics. His uniform was gone, replaced by plain clothes, but his resolve was evident. The weight of his mistakes drove him to become better, not just for himself, but for the people he had sworn to protect. For both men, the incident had been transformative. Derrick's quiet courage had forced a reckoning, and Parker's fall had become a catalyst for change. Their lives, though different, were now intertwined in a narrative of accountability and growth. As Derrick walked away from the mural, he glanced back one last time. The fight for justice wasn't over, but it was moments like this that reminded him of the progress that was possible. And with that he smiled, not for what had been, but for what could be.